Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Sniper on the Eastern Front, Chapter 6, Mr. Professor and his Carbolic Mouse. The thaw had started, and the riflemen had to make their way through a morass that was often knee-deep. Their shoes and trouser legs were so soaked with water and caked with mud that they could hardly move their legs. Physically exhausted, they dragged their feet along as best they could. Many of them were so tired that they slowed to a standstill and fell asleep where they stood. Their comrades grabbed them by the hand and pulled them on, and minutes later they awoke with a start and could not even remember how they had moved. The strain of the march was so overwhelming that even the pills, of which they were taking considerable quantities, had only minimal effect. Sepp carried his gun on his back, its telescopic side wrapped with bits of a tent square to protect it from the mud, and around his neck was slung an MP40 in case there should be a surprise firefight. He had become accustomed to staving off his tiredness and hunger by chewing dry biscuits, which he obtained by swapping his cigarette ration when he could. Behind the Russian moves, there lay more than just a transfer of their focus of attack. The operation developed into a huge offensive, which inflicted serious damage on the German lines on January 30th, 1944. At the confluence of the Bazavluk and Dnieper rivers, two German armies were suddenly at risk of being encircled. As so often before, an urgent request to shorten the German front was refused by army headquarters for so long that when permission finally came, it was almost too late. Fortunately, the clumsy Russian leadership helped them by dividing the Soviet force at the decisive moment instead of keeping them concentrated, and the German commanders were able to transfer sufficient units to the threatened sector to frustrate the attack. The exhausted Gebirgsjäger plodded wearily on through the mud. The higher purpose of this ordeal was not clear to them. Now they fought and marched without even thinking, rather than because of any personal desire to survive. They had become warriors, bound together by comradeship and the ever-present threat of death. There were no breaks anymore. The riflemen were like zombies. In their wet winter fighting suits, their faces drawn by hunger and fatigue, they were just drawn along by the vortex of events surrounding them. Sepp finally became sick. His constant exposure, coupled with drinking water scooped from bomb craters, gave him a severe bout of gastroenteritis. Gripped by shivering fit, he did not know from one minute to the next what he should do first, shit or puke. Captain Kloss, the battalion commander, found him shivering in the corner of his dugout, curled up like a wounded animal. Captain Max Kloss had taken over the 2nd Battalion when it moved into the Nikopol bridgehead. Driven by a desire to serve the fatherland wherever it was most necessary, he had volunteered to transfer from the Lapland front to the Eastern Front. He was inspired by a firm belief that National Socialism was a good thing, and he wore a Hitlerjugend badge on his uniform as an expression of his conviction. But he was no blind party supporter, but rather a committed and brave soldier. When he saw Sepp squatted down and trembling, he asked the company commander who he was. The latter explained that Sepp was 7th Company's marksman and that he was very good at his job. "We need every specialist," said Kloss. "This man has to get fit again. He's the very last marksman we have in this mess. I can't lose him too." Kloss told Sepp to go to the battalion command post and seek out the battalion runners. "Tell the boys that they must care for you." Then he turned to the company commander and said, "I hope you don't mind, Lieutenant." The latter just shrugged. Still trembling, Sepp trudged away. It was only about 1 kilometer to the battalion command post, but he had to pause and shit again and again on the way. Finally, he arrived at the runner's dugout, collapsed as he entered the improvised resting place, and moaned. "The old man said you should care for me. In particular, I need a new pair of underpants." "Of course, Miss Allerberger," came a voice from the back of the cave-like room. "Mr. Professor and his Carbolic mouse will come to powder your sore asshole." But they really cared for him. They got him black tea and found a highly effective diarrhea medicine called Dolantin, produced by a company called Höchst. This not only had a pain-relieving effect, but was also antispasmodic. It considerably eased the painful side effects of diarrhoic diseases. But Dolantin found its true destiny as a painkiller after the Höchst chemists managed to increase its effectiveness by a factor of 20 at the beginning of the 1940s. This stronger version was given the name Polamidon. Germany's enormous need for pain-relieving medicine is witnessed by its production of 650 tons of the stuff in 1944. Dolantin, rest and appropriate food eased Sepp's intestinal cramps and diarrhea. The care he received from the runners was phenomenal, and in a few days he had recovered. Now and then Captain Kloss came around to ask about his state of health, and then they started talking and realized that they got on well with each other. Sepp's legs were still a bit shaky, but Kloss said, "It's time for you to do something again. We've got 4 new sergeants. They are for your company. I thought you could take them under your wing, escort them over there, and show them what to do. My driver will take you." Less than a quarter of an hour later, they set out in a VW Jeep, but their ride ended after just a few minutes when a loud detonation rammed the steering wheel into the driver's hands with an iron fist. The car swerved to the left and tipped on its side with a lurch. Sepp heard himself scream, "Shit!" as he and his comrades were thrown out into the mud at the side of the road. Everybody knew that they had driven onto a mine that had torn off the left front wheel, so nobody dared to move. They kept lying where they were. "These fucking things must be ours," said the driver. "Yesterday it was clear through here and Ivan hasn't got here yet. Anybody wounded?" Apart from some bruises, they had all escaped unhurt. They crawled back to the car on all fours, feeling the ground carefully with their fingertips. They were discussing what to do next when a group of engineers came in their direction in single file. "What are you housewives doing here?" said one. "Did anybody say you could mess up our lovingly installed mines?" The brutal cynicism of this slender joke was not well received. "You fucking assholes will get something in your face. You're supposed to tell us where you put your mines." "Well, now you know about them," they were informed by the engineers leader. "And if you keep on grumbling, we'll just leave you sitting there. I suggest you follow us very carefully." "Follow them," said the driver. But the way to Sepp's company was now blocked, so the group returned to the battalion command post and reported to the old man. Thereafter, Kloss kept Sepp at his personal disposal with the battalion runners. The Russians did everything in their power to achieve their aim of driving the Germans back. Adherence to the rules of warfare disappeared along the Eastern Front and was replaced by inhuman brutality. The Soviets determined the new rules of engagement and set about paying us back for our early successes against them. In the process, they demonstrate an often inhumane harshness towards the enemy, not just against the soldiers but against the civilian population as well. Railwaymen had managed, despite heavy bombardment, to bring up 2 batteries of Gebirgsartillerie Regiment 112 as urgent reinforcements to the bridgehead. But just 1 locomotive had come through the bombardment intact, and on its last trip it was to evacuate the seriously wounded from the pocket. Sepp and his comrades passed the railway depot on the way to their new positions in the early morning. Hundreds of wounded were thronging around the wagons, very inadequately cared for. When they saw the small unit of riflemen still fit to fight, a look of hope came into their eyes. One spoke their thoughts out loud. "Hold Ivan back until the train is out, please." Though the effect of his words on the Lancers was almost imperceptible, they provided the necessary motivation they needed to hold out against the coming attack for as long as possible. The Soviets were only 1.5 kilometers from the depot, and the riflemen deployed from their line of march under fire and took up the fight. The train got away literally at the last minute under direct bombardment, but only a few kilometers further along the track, Russian fighter bombers attacked the helpless train, dropping their deadly payloads without any regard for the red crosses it bore. The wagon carrying the medical personnel was hit first, the bomb killing almost all the doctors. Amid a hail of bullets and bombs, the stricken wagon then pulled the rest of the train from the track. Its wagons crashed into each other and spat out their loads, leaving wounded men lying helplessly in the dirt. The next morning, their own withdrawal led Sepp and his comrades past that place. Before them lay a scene that was uncommon even amid the daily horrors of war. Strangely contorted corpses hung from the wrecked train, torn off limbs lay all around, bandages were scattered everywhere, fluttering in the wind. In their panic, the survivors had tried to drag themselves away, but most were not fit enough to endure the strain. Their wounds tore open again, and they bled to death. Life trickled away. Their bodies lay scattered over the ground in a circle about 300 meters wide. The few surviving medical personnel, including just 2 doctors, were helpless in the face of such a disaster, but hope returned when they saw the riflemen coming. But there were just 50 of them, some of whom were also wounded and bandaged, and compared to the magnitude of the situation, they represented a mere drop in the ocean. Added to that, the Russians were after the little fighting group and would catch up with them in about an hour. As fast as they could, they improvised stretchers to carry the wounded. Cruel as it might have been for those concerned, they had no choice but to help only those fit enough to walk and those with the best chance of survival. All the wounded who were almost dead or who were unlikely to survive being moved had to be left behind. 24 hours earlier, the Lancers had envied the wounded in a way because they were out of the fighting and theoretically on their way home. Now the war had caught up with them again and had made them comrades in a renewed fight for their lives. Suddenly, a gunshot broke the silence. Everyone looked in the direction of the sound and saw a rifleman with an .08 in his hand standing petrified beside a now dead man. Sepp was already next to him, asking what he'd done for heaven's sake. The Lancer sank to his knees, sobbing unrestrainedly. He needed a minute to regain his composure before he could report. The dead man had been his friend and neighbor. Both his legs had been amputated and his thumbs had been bloodily torn open again by the crash. In addition, his chest had been ripped up by splinters. It was incredible that he had survived these wounds for as long as he had. It was clear to him that he would be one of those left behind to the Russians' mercy, and when he saw his friend, he asked for a last good turn, a fast release from his sufferings. He begged so urgently that the rifleman did him a favor, though he knew it would haunt his memory for the rest of his life. The rest of the company was now ready for the march, and they left this place of misery, hoping that the Russians would care for the wounded or at least shoot them quickly. Sepp got out his telescopic rifle and dropped back a bit to cover the group's rear. They'd been walking for about half an hour when Sepp, following about 500 meters behind, hid in a bush to look around. That was when he saw a Russian patrol at a distance of about 150 meters. He had to act fast to force them to stop. He took careful aim with his rifle resting in the fork of a branch. He had a difficult field of fire, interspersed with bushes that the Russians were cleverly using as cover. Practice, intuition, and the feeling of an experienced rifleman for the right moment really paid in situations like these. Quietly, he aimed at the patrol leader with his telescopic sight, the reticle resting on the breast and following him through the bushes. There it was, the right moment. The Russian had stood in the open for several seconds, and Sepp's shot hit him in the chest and threw him backwards into the bushes. The others were experienced enough to immediately recognize the work of a marksman. They scattered like chickens attacked by a hawk and hid themselves as well as they could. Quickly, Sepp put shots as near as possible to two more, whose position he could make out, hitting the water bottle that one had hanging on his belt. That was enough to pin them to the ground for half an hour. Then, Sepp quickly rejoined his group and reported that the enemy was near. A small detachment immediately joined him at the rear, but, amazingly, they were not bothered again. As dusk gathered, they met another battalion of riflemen that had also left the enemy behind, and together they were ordered via radio to take position and stop the pursuing Russians for as long as possible. Chapter 7. Just another pre-planned catastrophe. In this other battalion, Sepp met a colleague he already knew of by hearsay. This was the marksman Josef, a Nuremberg man of his own age who had volunteered to join the Gebirgsjäger and, like Sepp, had come up with the idea of becoming a marksman after capturing a sniper's rifle. The two immediately got on well with each other. Roth's battalion commander knew the value of correctly deployed marksmen in a defensive position, and he gave them a free hand. While the rest of the troop entrenched, they agreed on a joint reconnaissance of the enemy's movements and to work together in the coming battle. It turned out that two pairs of trained eyes saw much more than one. At about 8 a.m. the next day, a shot suddenly whizzed among the riflemen as they were busy strengthening their positions, and a lance corporal collapsed to the ground with a scream, twitching. Fast as lightning, the others threw themselves into cover. Only one Lancer stayed with the wounded man for a fatal few seconds too long. He didn't hear the bang of the bullet that went into his skull behind the left eye and came out of his right eye, leaving a hole as big as a fist. A yellowish mass of blood and brain surged from it as he fell. There was a warning cry of, "Look out! Sniper!" Helplessly, the lookout guards let loose a hail of machine gun fire in the supposed direction of the sniper, but without effect, as was proved by the well-placed headshot that brought down one of the gunners moments later. Nobody dared to move. Sepp and Josef were still in their dugout when a runner rushed in and breathlessly reported the sniper attack. The battalion commander just said, "Riflemen, you know your job. Solve this problem." Moving quickly and making careful use of cover, the two hurried to the front line with the runner. He led them to a section of trench that was already finished, where they were welcomed by a sergeant who gave them a report of the events of the past few minutes. A little to one side, a piece of sap ended in a well-camouflaged observation position in a thicket. Sepp and Josef were able to reach this post without showing themselves, and they started to scan the area for signs of a possible marksman's hiding place. Despite straining their eyes, they saw nothing suspicious, even though they paid special attention to one particular area because of where the first of their comrades had been hit. Still, nothing. Hours passed. They discussed where they would position themselves if they were a Russian marksman, but even the seemingly ideal location they would have chosen showed no signs of movement. At around noon, another rifleman was hit while throwing his tin of shit over the edge of a trench, but this time the victim was lucky, the projectile glancing off his helmet to strike his upper arm. Luckily, the Russian marksman hadn't used an explosive bullet, as was more usual, so the Lancer escaped with a gaping flesh wound. Josef and Sepp had been looking through their binoculars towards the Russian lines at the time, and both saw a patch of grass sway as the pressure wave of the Russian marksman's shot disturbed it. They admired their opponent's imagination. He had clearly hidden himself in an earth cave dug through a dam. But now the question was he experienced enough to leave his position, or would he stay there? The latter possibility seemed to be indicated by the fact that all of his shots had clearly been made from the same direction. So Sepp and Josef decided to lure him into showing himself. They settled on providing him with a fake target that would be exposed by a comrade. Josef would take position about 50 meters away from Sepp, and they would both shoot into the enemy's supposed position as soon as the grass moved when he fired. They stuffed a bread bag with grass and put it on a stick, on top of which they placed a cap. Josef handed the dummy to a comrade and told him to hold it carefully above the trench's edge in exactly 10 minutes. Both marksmen then readied themselves and were aiming at the assumed position of their enemy when the cap appeared above the trench's edge exactly on cue. And their cunning paid off. The Russian shot too early, not calculating on a trap, and from the same position. He had hardly fired when both Sepp and Josef shot at nearly the same moment. They had each loaded their Russian marksman's rifle with one of the few captured explosive bullets they had. Away in the earth cave there was a dull thud. Attentively they watched the small earth dam through their telescopic sights and saw hectic activity behind it as something was carried away. A curious Soviet observer appeared with binoculars on his eyes and immediately paid with his life. Bullets from the two German marksmen's rifles simultaneously hit his head, which burst like an overripe pumpkin under the force of the double impact. Only his binoculars remained, lying intact on the edge of the trench. Now it was the Russians who did not dare leave cover, and the Lancers were able to finish their trenches without further interruption. Sepp and Josef prepared well-camouflaged alternative positions for the coming Soviet attack, dividing the approaches so that they could give each other covering fire. In order to remain unseen for as long as possible, they agreed to maintain a crossfire until the enemy was about 100 meters away, and then to switch to straight approach fire. This strategy worked well and contributed to the troop holding out for 2 days, which enabled the evacuation of their own wounded and those they had rescued from the train. But, bit by bit, the bridgehead around Nikopol gave way, and once again encirclement threatened. As their respective units were now regrouping, Allerberger and Roth had to split up. Knowing the special hardship and strain that faced marksmen, they shook hands for a very long time and wished each other the essential luck they required to survive the war. Then they parted, hoping to see each other again one day. But they had learned an important lesson from their encounter. There are situations in which cooperation with a second man, a special observer, is a huge advantage. Although Sepp had sworn to only work alone after Balduin Moser's death, he had to admit that teamwork was advantageous. Sepp therefore convinced his company commander of the value of having an observer with him, and thereafter, whenever he needed an observer, he was allowed to choose one from among his experienced comrades. As the hard fighting continued, Gebirgsjägerregiment 144 again and again had to lead diversionary attacks to keep important traffic junctions free for withdrawing units. Though it was bled white in these operations, it was a testimony to the regiment that it was able to hold its assigned positions against the massive Russian attacks. Sometimes the Lancers even succeeded in mounting small counterattacks. But the weakened regiment suffered enormous losses, so that its very existence was endangered. Entire companies were destroyed to the last man. After 4 days of severe fighting, on February the 12th, 1944, they got the order for a general withdrawal from the bridgehead. The regiment was so decimated and had been without supplies for so long that it had no heavy weapons left, and every Lancer had only about 5 or 10 cartridges for his personal firearm. Under such circumstances, when it was harassed by the enemy, its few marksmen became the unit's artillery. Only they were able to form a rearguard that could hold the enemy at a respectful distance. In order for the marksmen to keep fighting, every Lancer gathered up Russian ammunition wherever he could. Only with great effort and huge losses did the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division escape from the pocket and reach the new front line of the Inulets. The weather changed and became an enemy and an ally at the same time. It was an enemy because a storm of snow and ice began that threatened to annihilate the physically exhausted riflemen who had to face it without any protection following their withdrawal. But it was an ally because any attempts at organized pursuit became impossible under such circumstances. Apathetically, the Lancers staggered across the steppe, the ice crystals stabbing into their faces like needles. The thermometer sank to minus 50 degrees centigrade. Anyone who stopped moving or fell to the ground with exhaustion had frostbite within a few minutes, which often proved lethal. The iron fittings on their mountain boots transmitted the cold right through to their feet. Boots, sweaty socks, and skin froze together. Many of those afflicted thus could only move by crawling. The medics were unable to help them much because all their liquid medicines had frozen in their containers. Only for the worst cases did they have a few morphine ampoules that they carried in their mouths to keep them warm. Wounds immediately froze and became icy. There were fights over the winter clothing of Russian corpses found frozen in the snow, and lucky was he who could get a felt cap or felt boots this way. Uncompromisingly, the riflemen kept each other moving. As soon as Sepp paused, he was kicked by a boot or hit with a rifle butt, and he likewise hit anybody who tried to stop. Despite these measures, many soldiers got frostbite or even died, so weak they had become. The number of those fit to fight dwindled daily. With great effort, the wounded were dragged along for as long as they had any chance of recovery. Those who would die anyway were mercilessly left behind, as all the baggage animals had been eaten. Their weapons, covered with ice, were useless. The extreme cold made the steel shrink so that they could not even move the bolts. The high quality of the German weapons, with their well-engineered, close-fitting parts, worked against them now. The Russian weapons, by contrast, were constructed with greater tolerances and worked even at temperatures below zero. The stone-hard frozen ground even prevented the preparation of defensive positions. Only animal instincts of self-preservation drove the riflemen on through the depressing steppe, while the storm constantly increased. As if in a trance, numbed by hunger and exhaustion, Sepp stumbled on through the knee-deep snow, his hood pulled down around his face, his padded camouflage jacket pulled close about him, and his marksman's gun on his back wrapped in a cover. The cold was almost unbearable. Ahead, the shadowy silhouettes of a farm and a huge pile of straw emerged from the grey haze of the falling snow, and at that moment the ground below him suddenly gave way. With a cry, he fell into a hole that had been covered with snow and found himself staring into the frozen face of a dead Red Army soldier, distorted to an ugly grin. He scrambled back to the surface again like a beetle, digging his way out from the snow on all fours. Now, there was also movement in the burned-out farm that was only 30 meters away. As if electrified, the riflemen jumped to protect themselves, but their frozen hands could not get hold of their weapons, which were ice-covered and unusable anyway. The rag covering Sepp's rifle had proved itself useless. Scraps of Russian conversation were carried to them by the wind. Everyone stopped, anxiously waiting for the Russians to open fire, but nothing happened. Minutes of terrifying uncertainty passed until it became obvious that the Russians were not in a fit state to fight either. Both parties withdrew carefully. Night was falling, and the snow was coming down even more heavily. Protection from the weather became their prime consideration. Instinctively, the Lancers approached a huge pile of straw, their only potential protection from the roaring force of nature. Then came the point when they threw all caution to the growing wind. They had to take shelter from the storm. A few more steps and they were there. Quickly they burrowed into the warm straw and huddled together there like young pigs, and so survived the storm. For 2 days and 2 nights it roared on unrestrained, and even the rules of war had to bend to its will. The pile of straw became a refuge for the Russians too, who crawled into its shelter from the other side. Unable to fight, the Lancers and their remorseless foes were separated by no more than a few meters of straw. On the morning of February the 20th, the storm abated and they found that their weapons, protected from the cold, now worked again. Nervousness spread amongst the Lancers at the thought of their impending fight with the Russians on the other side of the pile of straw, because nobody knew how and when it would start. 3 riflemen dug their way out to make a reconnaissance. When they returned half an hour later, they gave the all clear, obviously relieved. The Soviets had withdrawn in the early morning. Again they trudged on through the snow to their new fighting area. The physical condition of the Lancers declined at an alarming rate, but at the last minute the regiment reached a supply depot and obtained ammunition, food, clothes and blankets. They even got small numbers of replacement personnel. They settled down in the ruins of a village for several days. Since he belonged to the battalion staff, Sepp benefited from access to such luxuries as a strong dugout and even an oven. He was daydreaming in a cozy corner when Captain Kloss returned from a regimental meeting. Shivering with the cold, he sat down in front of the oven and stretched his feet in their wet boots closer to the warmth. Then tiredness overcame him, and leaning back against the wall, he fell asleep. Sometime later, Sepp looked over and saw that Kloss's boots were smoking. Then the officer jumped up with a scream and leapt around, shouting, "Shit, shit, shit, that's hot!" He tried to take his boots off but failed because the wet leather had dried too fast and had shrunk around his feet. The only thing left was to pour a bucket of water over them so that the leather could expand again. The soldiers present grinned broadly at the solution of the crisis. Fortunately, clothing replacements were among the supplies that had been received, so Kloss was able to change from his leather boots into some new felt ones. On February 25th, the Russians attacked again, but the attack was halted by a successful barrage from the now operational mountain artillery regiment. The riflemen used the ensuing lull to withdraw back to the new front line on the inulets. As had happened so often before, several decisive mistakes had been made when laying down this new front line. While the frontline officers were able to develop practical, strategic, and tactical concepts by correctly analyzing the situation and estimating their resources and the enemy's strength, the Army High Command staff at OKH again and again torpedoed their solutions by issuing ludicrous orders to hold unnecessary positions. The consequences of these irresponsible decisions were huge losses of material and human lives that could not be replaced. The army's overstrained logistics could not compensate for losses on such a scale. Military operations were compromised and dwindled into an uncoordinated withdrawal that became more and more chaotic and ended with everybody saving himself in any way he could. The new front along the inulets became just another pre-planned catastrophe. Shortening of the line in order to preserve it was prohibited, essential reorganization of their forces was not carried out. So the Russian attacks were awaited by an overstretched and thinly defended front line. Units with a high fighting morale and considerable experience, such as the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division, became the great white hope of commanders in these situations. Consequently, they were thrown into the heart of the battle again and again. The entire responsibility for stopping the enemy breaking through and preventing encirclement rested on their shoulders. Backup positions and reserves could only be improvised and provided no real operational security. The price in personnel and material was immense. On March 1st, the Soviet attack crashed into the riflemen's position again. The Russians' determination seemed to be especially intense this time. In the area held by the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division and the neighboring 16th Panzer Grenadier Division, the Soviets were able to constantly replace their losses. Up to 1,000 new soldiers were added each day, while the German losses could not be compensated for. On the 3rd day of the attack, the armored division's infantry were virtually destroyed by the Russians, and the Gebirgsjäger riflemen had to defend their area too. By the 4th day, the division had been reduced to half its fighting strength. By a miracle, Sepp remained unhurt apart from cuts and bruises, although he was always at the center of the action. Once again, it was proved that high morale and experience could compensate for material superiority for a long time, but by the end of the 5th day, Sepp's battalion had dwindled to just 60 fighting men. While they fought on against the enemy, who was attacking them from two sides, the sound of fierce fighting suddenly arose to their rear. At the same time, a signaller received a radio message in which the battalion headquarters reported a Russian attack and called for help. It seemed that an enemy combat group had managed to infiltrate the riflemen's front and was now trying to neutralize the control center of the German resistance. Outnumbering them by 100 to 30, the Soviets totally surprised the headquarters detachment, which was not prepared for such an attack. A violent firefight developed in which the ammunition of the defenders was quickly exhausted, and more men fell to the raging fire of their assailants. The attack on the main fighting line was by then ebbing to a long-range firefight, so that the company commander risked sending a few men to support the defenders of the command post. He also contacted the neighboring companies, which sent a few more men. Quickly, a small force of just 20 riflemen were assembled, among them Sepp and a comrade experienced in combat patrols, who would support him as an observer. It was now about 7 a.m. and it was decided to mount the counter-attack at 8. A short hour later, the riflemen moved off as fast as possible, but with all necessary care, in the direction of the command post, which was less than 1.5 kilometers away. After 15 minutes, they encountered the Russians' combat group. In a bushy, slightly hilly area, the command post lay in a valley at the foot of a steeply rising hill. This could not be occupied by the inadequate German units, but for the Russians it held a high strategic value because from its top they could be able to control the German positions. The defenders had withdrawn to the last fortified dugout and were down to their last few rounds. Now they replied to the furious fire of their attackers with just single-aimed shots. The approaches to the base were covered with corpses from both sides. The Gebirgsjäger relief force paused to get an overview of the situation. Now was the time for the marksman and his observer to prove themselves. Sepp and his comrade quickly chose a group of bushes that provided them with good camouflage, but had a clear view of the battlefield. The plan was for the riflemen to commence their attack while the two of them eliminated as many of the enemy as possible. The observer had a very wide range of vision compared to the very limited one the marksman had through the lens of his telescopic sight. With his better overview of the scene, the observer could clearly increase the effectiveness of the marksman by giving him exact aiming instructions. Sepp had barely raised his weapon into a firing position when he saw a lancer he thought to be dead from a bloody head wound trying to raise himself on his hands, only to be immediately hit by a Russian machine gun salvo. His head and neck turned into a bloody mass under the impact of the projectiles. Sepp's observer had already identified the gunman. Small earthwork, 10 meters to the right. Sepp swiveled his gun and took the Russian into his sights, the reticle coming to rest on the Russian's partly exposed chest. His shot hit its mark at 150 meters with fatal certainty. His shot was the signal for the relief force to attack. The rifleman opened fire, while Sepp's bullets hit every enemy his observer could find. The ensuing fight was short but violent. Suddenly, the Russians lost sight of their goal amid the unexpected crossfire and mounting losses, and, shooting wildly in all directions, they withdrew after a few minutes. About 20 of them were seen to disappear into the trees. They left 80 dead and wounded behind. The riflemen had no time to do any more, and after a short consultation with the survivors of the headquarters troop, they headed off. 20 minutes later, they were back with their comrades in their main fighting line. For 6 days, the fight had surged against them almost without pause, and the lancers were exhausted so that they fell into a deep coma-like sleep as soon as they were inactive for even a few moments. Often in situations like these, the medics distributed the stimulant pervitin to mobilize the riflemen's last physical reserves. The 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division managed to hold its position until March the 7th, but already on the 6th day, the Soviets had crossed the Inulets to neighboring sectors and had burst to the German front line. Now the riflemen were sticking into the Russian line like a thorn that had to be pulled out quickly. With more and fresh infantry forces, the Russians stormed the German positions. The mountain riflemen of Gebirgsjägerregiment 144 were pressed back until they stood in furious close combat that extended even to the regiment's headquarters. Coherent command became impossible. Every group fought in its own and for plain survival. In the midst of this confusion, the order arrived to withdraw across the Inulets immediately. In the meantime, the Russians had managed to cut the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division's line of retreat almost completely. Their supplies were destroyed, and the division's main first aid post was overrun. There remained a single defended corridor about half a kilometer wide through which they could withdraw. The few survivors of the 144th, still fit enough to move, commenced a fighting withdrawal. Scattered soldiers and men from other units joined them as they went. Among them was a group of 4 medics who had escaped the Russian attack on the divisional first aid post. These men were clearly totally worn out and demonstrated obviously disturbed behavior, the product of the psychologically distressing experiences they had endured. A sergeant who wanted information about where they had come from and what had happened got only jumbled sentences in reply, and he handed them over to other medical personnel as soon as he could. Medics, care for your mates. I think they've seen the Holy Ghost the way they are talking. They need a drink and hit in the neck, but try to do it with motherly kindness. Perhaps they tell you what happened. And in fact, some food and alcohol calmed them down, but their description of the events they had witnessed frightened their audience and increased their fears of possible Russian imprisonment. It seemed that far from all the German wounded had found a place in the last train that tried to escape from the Nikopol pocket. In particular, the hopeless cases had been left at the main aid station with a doctor and 7 ambulancemen. To indicate their defenselessness, they had put up a white flag and a flag of the Red Cross and piled their weapons in a clearly visible heap in front of the tent. It was a Mongolian unit that came up and occupied the place. Carefully running from cover to cover, they had surrounded the aid station and demanded that the lancers came out with raised hands. In Russian, they said, "Come out with raised hands, you fascist pigs." 2 ambulancemen stepped in front of the operation tent. From a Russian language book issued to soldiers on the Eastern Front, they had picked out some phrases that they shouted over to the Soviets. They said, "We unarmed, here only wounded, we surrender to the Soviet army." Screaming something unintelligible at the lancers, the Mongolians approached with their weapons in a firing position. Hands above their heads, the 2 ambulancemen awaited them, their knees trembling obviously. The first Mongolian reached them and screamed an order that the medics could not understand. Mere seconds passed, and then he hit one of them in the face with his rifle butt without warning. Moaning, the soldier fell down, blood from his broken nose and split lips streaming between his fingers as he pressed them to his face. The Russian kept screaming and kicked the man lying on the ground. Obviously, his reaction was not what was required of him, because suddenly the Mongolian stepped back, aimed at the soldier with his machine pistol and shot him in the chest. The medic collapsed, his life seeping away with a bloody wheeze. At this moment, the doctor in a bloody apron and another ambulance man stepped out of the tent to see what was happening. This distracted the shooter, while 4 other Soviets came up and pushed the Germans back into the tent, screaming incomprehensible orders and pushing the barrels of their guns into their backs. On the operating table lay a wounded man with serious head wounds who was being tended to by another medic following his operation. One of the Mongolians pushed him away, pulled a knife from his boot and thrust it into the wounded man's chest, saying, "This fascist pig won't bother us any longer." He rammed his knife into the man's heart 2 or 3 times before withdrawing it. The Germans looked on in shock, with a dreadful premonition of what was about to ensue. They were pushed into the neighboring tent in which the wounded were lying. A Mongolian sergeant pushed the doctor aside as he tried to persuade him to spare the wounded and shouted, "Now we will show you what happens to those who have attacked Mother Russia and killed women and children." Signaling to a soldier with a wave of his hand and indicating the wounded, he commanded, "Cut their throats like sheep." It sent shivers down the Lancers' spines when they saw the demonic gleam in the eyes of the 2 approaching Mongolians. They must have been experienced shepherds and butchers, because they took knives from their boots that they had obviously brought from home, and they knew how to use them. They were the ideal tools for the following apocalyptic deed. Without the slightest sign of emotion, they went over to the wounded and with well-honed expertise yanked back their heads and cut deeply into their throats of their helpless victims. The sharp knife sliced into the flesh with such ease that in some throats the bones of the spine could be seen through the gushing blood. The Mongolians worked fast and methodically, and after a few minutes the whole tent had been transformed into a slaughterhouse. The dying Lancers writhed with pain on their bed. The doctor, though he was confronted by the gruesome horrors of war every day, changed color to a greenish-yellow shade and could not stand any longer. "Weakling!" shouted the sergeant and beat his gun butt into the kneeling man's face. Like a match, the doctor's nosebone cracked and blood shot from his face, splashing onto the sergeant's boots. "Swine, look at my boots!" With that, he grabbed his machine gun by the barrel and brought the butt down on the doctor's head. A crack like a split in an overripe melon revealed the break in his skull. 2 or 3 more well-aimed blows with the metal butt, and the doctor was dead. Frozen with horror, the ambulance men stood in the corner. One was pulled forward by the sergeant so that he could use the front of his uniform to wipe the blood from his weapon. The Mongolians then started to pillage the aid station. The last 6 ambulance men squatted with their hands behind their heads in front of the operating tent, guarded by another Mongolian who was obviously angry at being unable to participate in the looting. He said, "God damn, why do I have to guard these stupid pigs? They'll be killed anyway. Why can't I kill them now?" "Shut up and do what I say," an NCO moaned back. "The old one wants to take them to task again. Perhaps these birdies will chirp a song for us and will tell us where their heroic comrades are." One of the ambulance men knew a bit of Russian and understood that they were bad times ahead. "They want to stick us like the wounded," he whispered through his teeth. "We've had it anyway, so I'd say we make a break for it at the next opportunity and try to get the others. Our men can't be far." "You're right," his neighbor said. "I'll bump off Ivan, then we run through the tent, jump over the waste pit and get into the bushes. We keep running until we're safe. It's everyone for himself, but try to keep together." The Mongolians were bragging loudly about their haul, especially when they reached the catering area. Excluded from the pillaging, the guard's rage steadily intensified, and most of his attention was devoted to ensuring his share of the plunder by shouts to his comrades. Then the opportunity came. As the Mongolians dug into some boxes, the guard eyed them greedily and became inattentive. In a single fast movement, one of the medics pulled a dagger from his boot, jumped up like a tiger, got behind the guard with one stride, and pulled him around the corner of the tent. The next moment, he rammed the dagger into the Russian's kidney, turning it quickly 2 or 3 times. The Mongolian stiffened with the pain, his dull moans stifled by the Lancer's hand on his mouth. The medic's comrades were already away through the tent, and he followed behind them. But they were not yet at the other end when the wounded Mongolian's cry of pain alerted the others. Machine pistols barked and bullets pattered through the sailcloth of the tent and tore down the hindmost medic with the dagger still in his hand. The others raced on and leapt wildly across the waste pit in which tissue and human parts were heaped, single amputated limbs sticking up from the piles so realistically. The last medic but one got caught in a tent rope as he jumped and fell headlong into the pit. The next one reached the other side but turned back and reached out his hand to his comrade. Taking a firm grip, he hauled him out of the pit, only to see him cut down by a burst of machine gun fire in the back. Though they buzzed dangerously about him, the bullets missed the other medic, who threw himself into the bushes and crawled through the undergrowth, the Mongolian's gunfire scything through the leaves and branches overhead. To his right, he saw his comrades running. He rolled into a long hollow and sprinted after them. Experienced lancers very quickly obtained a small compass for themselves that they always kept with them in case they should ever get separated from their comrades. Sepp, for instance, always had one in his pocket, and one of the ambulance men had one as well, which would now save their escapees' lives. Managing to avoid the enemy, they had hurried after the retreating German forces for 2 days before finally catching up with them. Then, after reporting the names of their slain comrades to the commanding officer, they had quietly joined the lines of marching lancers, alone with their thoughts. The survivors of Gebirgsjäger Regiment 144 managed to link up with the main fighting line, but this brought little relief. Its soldiers were at the end of their endurance. They had received no supplies for days, and everybody was dirty and lousy. Ammunition for their small arms was almost exhausted, and every shot had to be used sparingly. All that kept them going was the fatefulness of their situation. They knew that only order, discipline, and silent forbearance of their tribulations would give them any chance of surviving their ordeal, because the only alternative was certain death at the enemy's hands. Though it was invisible to the eyes of soldiers fighting in the front line, the commanders of the 6th Army made a last-minute attempt to prevent encirclement. The Russians had already made a deep penetration in the German line, and it was only thanks to the lack of coordination amongst their army leaders that encirclement had not yet been achieved. 15 German divisions were now pulled together to spearhead a push through the single remaining avenue of escape to cross the inulets, get through to the Bug, and establish a new front line on its western shore. The 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division was at the forefront of its operation and reached the inulets first. It managed to find a passable crossing point, and led by the Pioneer Battalion, a load-bearing dam was built. Harassing attacks by the Soviets continued to be uncoordinated and were turned back. The division's 138th and 144th regiments took positions to defend the bridgehead against the enemy's anticipated attack and to ensure the passage of the divisions that were following. On March 15, 1944, heavy rain set in that finally froze and turned to an ice storm. Without any protection, exposed to the weather, bad cold spread rapidly among the chronically exhausted soldiers. Without the slightest possibility of relief from their misery, the lancers stood in their holes, tormented by fever and the shivers. And there we go, another 2 chapters done. Not much to learn from this episode, except things that are common knowledge today. We all know that the Russian winter sucks, and that being taken prisoner by the Russians is generally not a good idea. So, thank you for watching, consider subscribing, see you next episode, cheers.